Hello YouTube. In 2024, I tested pretty much every flagship foldable phone, and I was pretty confident I knew exactly which one had the best cameras, the Vivo X Fold 3 Pro. Then, just before Christmas, a late contender arrived. Huawei released the Mate X6 globally, and I think this might have better cameras. But there's only one way to find out, so today we're going to put them head to head and see exactly which one's better. Alright, to start off, we'll have a quick close-up look at the hardware of these two phones. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the specs because you can just look everything up if you want, but I'll just talk about what they're like to use. In terms of overall footprint, they are quite similar, as you can see. The Huawei is a little bit thinner. Neither are quite as thin as the Honor Magic V3, but neither are too chunky either. I can feel a slight difference in my hand and in my pocket with the Huawei. It does just feel a little bit slimmer. I think part of that is because it's a little more curvy as well. The edges are a lot more squared off on the Vivo phone, whereas you get softer curves on the Huawei. You can see it on the side rails. Each side's a bit rounded off, whereas Vivo's a little more square. I've got the red vegan leather version of the Huawei phone, and it does remind me a lot of the Mate XT triple folding phone, just with one less fold, obviously. The sides are silver, not gold like on the Mate XT, but I do think it's a very nice looking phone. It's also available with a non-vegan leather back. It's some kind of fiber material. I'm not exactly sure what it's made out of, but it feels a bit more like a glass back, whereas Vivo's got the more traditional matte glass back. And it's very fingerprint resistant, which I'm a big fan of, but it is a tiny bit slippery. Most of the time I use the cases that came included in the box. You've seen the Vivo one before. It's pretty cheap acrylic-y thing with a thin strip of vegan leather on it, but it does look quite nice and it's pretty low profile. And the Huawei case is very similar. It's a hard acrylic-y type material with a thin piece of vegan leather glued on. It does have a built-in kickstand, which I really like. This is spring-loaded. It's made from metal and it's quite a nice fidget toy actually. But I really like that it can rotate. You can rotate it, what's that, 270 degrees, and it can't quite hold the phone up in all orientations, but you do get a bit of flexibility with that, which is always nice. Moving on to the screens, I do think the Huawei feels a little more modern. It's got the kind of quad micro curve sort of design and a very slim hinge at the side, whereas the hinge is a little more squared off and you get more of a curve on the right hand side. I apologize if you can see all the scratches on my screen. This is one of my daily driver phones and I've dropped it a bunch of times and I don't use a screen protector. I think if you go for a Vivo, you probably want to use a screen protector. I don't think the glass is the most scratch resistant out there. Both phones feel quite natural to use when folded down, but the Huawei is slightly wider, which feels more normal than the Vivo. The Vivo is slightly slimmer and a tiny bit taller. Not enough to make much of a difference. And on paper, the Vivo is a lot brighter, but have I noticed that in use? Not really. They're both plenty bright enough for me. And on the inside, both have very large displays. The Vivo feels a little bit bigger because it has these squared off corners, but the actual footprint isn't massively different. These curved corners do just make the Huawei feel a tiny bit smaller. And again, the Vivo is a lot brighter on paper. I can actually see here that it's a tiny bit brighter, but both are bright enough. I've used both on bright sunny days. What I feel makes a bigger difference than the brightness is the material of the screen protector. The screen protector on the Huawei is a much higher gloss. It's a bit more like the one on the Samsung Z Fold 6, whereas the Vivo screen protector is very matte. And obviously there's an advantage to having a matte screen when it comes to reflections, but it does make it very susceptible to smudging. As soon as you touch it, you're going to leave oily marks on it. And on the Huawei, they're just not quite as noticeable. And your finger glides across it just a tiny bit easier. But it makes the crease a lot more noticeable. The Vivo's is a tiny bit shallower, but I think the fact that you don't notice it as much is down to the low reflectivity of the screen protector. Whereas the Huawei, it's a tiny bit deeper, but it's also much more noticeable when the light hits it. The Vivo has dual ultrasonic fingerprint scanners. You get an ultrasonic scanner no matter which screen you're using. The Huawei just has a fingerprint scanner mounted on the side here, They're both very quick. I do prefer the ultrasonic fingerprint scanner, I think, but that's completely a matter of preference. You might like one more, you might like the other. Both have a centrally placed camera cutout on the outer screen, and on the inner screen, it's in the top right corner on both, which is what I like to see. It's nice and tucked out the way. It's not going to get in the way when you're watching full screen content. Both of these phones are the global versions, which means Huawei's running EMUI and Vivo's running FunTouch OS. I'm not going to go too much into the software, but I'm sure everyone already knows it's kind of a ball ache on Huawei. You need to use workarounds to get your Google apps working. And they do work. I use the Micro G project and the Aurora store, and it's almost native support, but there are niggles, and to be honest, using it as your main device is still a bit of a pain in 2025. FunTouch OS is nothing special. It's not my favorite OS, but it gets the job done, and it's very easy to live with. So in terms of usability, it's Vivo all the way. But the place where Huawei might make it worthwhile is with the cameras. I'll put the specs that I have on the screen right now, but frustratingly, Huawei hasn't said what sensor sizes it's using in this phone. I think judging by the size of the lenses, we can tell they're probably quite similar. And if anything, the telephoto looks like it might be larger. But whatever's in here is kind of a mystery. In both cases, you get a 23, 24mm-ish main sensor, but the Huawei has a variable aperture, and it's the first global folding phone that has a variable aperture. It goes from f1.4 to f4.0. Of course, both have an ultra-wide camera. Vivo's slightly more megapixels, 50 megapixel versus 40 megapixel, but both have a very similar field of view, about 120 degrees-ish, and both have a telephoto sensor. The Vivo's is a 3x and the Huawei's is a 4x. Both of them can focus pretty close up, but I don't think anything is going to come close to rivaling the macro capabilities of this Huawei phone. As you'll see when we get into the comparison, selfie cameras, of course you get two, one on the outer screen, one on the inner screen. They are 32 megapixels, both of them, on the Vivo, and they're both 8 megapixel on the Huawei. Both of them have pretty big batteries, but the Vivo lasts a bit longer for me. And both of them charge pretty quick, but the Vivo does charge slightly quicker. Both have got 50-watt wireless charging, which is pretty awesome. As you know, I'm a big fan of wireless charging, especially when it's that quick. And yeah, that's the hardware. So now, let's take a look at the cameras. Okay, as usual, we're starting on the selfie camera of these two phones. The Huawei's recording at 4K, and the Vivo can only do 1080p. Both are at 30 frames per second. When I say selfie camera, I'm talking about the selfie camera on the cover screen. There's obviously one inside, which gives you about the same results, to be honest. We're using the built-in mics, and you'll see down below which one you're listening to right now. Not a lot of wind, so both of them should sound quite decent. Of course, with a foldable phone, it's really easy to film yourself using the main camera. I'm actually not using the screen folded out right now, so I'm guessing a little bit, but it's much easier if you're only using one at a time. And yeah, this is the kind of view you get. The Huawei does have an adjustable aperture on its main camera, so it's deciding how wide the aperture is going to be. You might have more or less background blur depending on that. And there's also the ultra-wide cameras, both of which have autofocus, and they get loads more in the shot. Okay, quick run through of the video zooms now. We're at Woollerton Hall today, which is actually Batman's house in the good Batman movies. I'll let you decide if you agree with that. We're on the ultra-wides at the minute, and you can see that the Huawei is quite a bit wider. Now here's the main lens, which is much more similar. 2 times, which is a digital crop on each phone. 4 times, which is Huawei's telephoto. 3 times, which is Vivo's telephoto. Huawei gives a button for 10x, Vivo gives a button for 6x. And if we slide out to the max, Huawei can go all the way to 20x at 4K, and Vivo can only go to 10x at 4K. Although in the preview, the Vivo looks more stable and maybe a little clearer, but we'll have to see what it looks like when the video is processed. Okay, now time for a quick video stabilization test. We're on the ultra-wide of both phones, and I'm walking along at a normal pace. Now here's what it looks like when I have a quick jog. Switching over to the main camera, here's walking along normally, and here's with a quick jog. And finally the telephotos. Huawei's obviously a lot more zoomed in, and because of that it's looking a lot more shaky. But here's what walking along looks like, and here's a quick jog. Okay, quick macro to infinity focusing test to see how well and how quickly the phones adjust focus. We're starting on the main camera. We're going to use this sign. We'll get as close as we can, which is very, very close on both of them. So here's macro. Here's infinity. Huawei pulsed there. Back to macro. That's infinity. It looks like Vivo's a lot quicker. And there's, yeah, same thing again. Huawei takes a while longer, but it gets there in the end. Now let's try the same thing with the ultra wide. Again, I think we can get very close with both of them. Looks like Vivo can get closer. About there for the Huawei. There's macro. There's infinity. There's macro. And there's infinity. Now the telephotos, both of which can focus very close as well. How close can we get? About there for the Vivo. Huawei's like a microscope, you can get as close as you like. Here's macro. Here's infinity. Here's macro. And there's infinity. Both of these phones have an artificial background blurring mode for video. Vivo can do it at 4K. Huawei can only do it at 1080p. This is the kind of effect you get. I'll get up close and further away so that you can see how the focus shifts about. And how does it do with my fingers? Most phones struggle with cutting out my fingers. Now this is what the blur effect looks like at max strength. So the background should be noticeably blurrier than it was last time. This works on the main camera and the telephoto on both phones. Doesn't matter which one you use, but neither of them can do it on the ultra wide. Okay, it's night time now. We're back on the selfie cameras. Again, Huawei can do 4K 30, Vivo can only do 1080p 30, and neither of them can do 60 frames per second on the cover screen selfie camera. But this is the kind of image you get at night time. Neither of these have autofocus either, by the way. You need the rear cameras for that. Okay, now the rear cameras, which should look a lot cleaner at night. And obviously these ones have autofocus, of course. Interesting to see how these do. The Huawei can open wider if it feels like it needs to, but it can also stop itself down, whereas the Vivo's got a more traditional fixed aperture. So, how does it look at night? How's the stabilization doing? And how's the exposure on my face? And the ultra wides definitely aren't going to look as good, but might be decent enough. I think the Huawei might struggle because it's really wide in video mode, whereas Vivo's cropped in a little bit more. Okay, now just a quick run through the zoom range while we're standing still. This is the ultra wide of each. Now the main camera. 2 times on the Huawei, 2 times on the Vivo, 3 times on the Vivo, 4 times on the Huawei, 10 times on the Huawei, 6 times on the Vivo, 10 times is the max on the Vivo, and it's looking pretty crusty, especially at night. If I tap to focus, that'll help. Not really. And the Huawei can go all the way up to 20 times, but should you? I don't know. It looks pretty shaky and horrible. Now let's do the stabilization. We're on the ultra wide of each phone, walking along at a normal pace. And here's with a bit of a jog. One times now, walking along normally, and here's with a bit of a jog on. 4 times telephoto on the Huawei, 3 times on the Vivo. Here's walking along normally, and here's a quick jog. Okay, now we're back on my favourite really dark street. I've just turned some more security light on, so that's not so dark now. Let's keep walking. We're back on the selfie cameras, and on the phone screen, it looks like the Huawei's doing a better job, but it's always kind of hard to tell on the phone screen. If I get closer to the street light, should look a little bit better. But yeah, how do they look? Now switching to the rear cameras, and I'm starting quite well lit. So this shouldn't look too bad, I don't think. But as I keep walking, I'll be backlit, and then it will likely look a lot worse. So yeah, this is how the main cameras look in extreme low light conditions. And here's the ultra-wide cameras, which always look terrible in low light. But I'll keep shooting on this until I get closer to a street light to give them a fair shake. So yeah, here's a street light. What do you think? Okay, now we're just going to walk along and run through all the lenses to get an idea of what the stabilization is like when it's this dark. These are the ultra wides, which look awful. But now we've got the main cameras, which are miles better. And finally, we'll do the telephotos, which obviously is 4 times on the Huawei and 3 times on the Vivo. Before we get into the photos, we've just got a quick message from today's sponsor, but don't skip ahead because this is all part of the comparison and it's your first chance to get a quick 16:9 full screen look at the quality of these two phones. So stick with me and we'll get into the photos in just a minute. If you're in the market for a new phone, it's the perfect time to show your earholes some love too. This portion of the video is sponsored by Raycon and their Everyday Earbuds, the perfect audio companion for just about any occasion. The Everyday Earbuds are an affordable set of wireless earbuds that are packed with features normally reserved for more expensive sets. You can expect advanced noise cancellation, up to 32 hours of battery life on a charge, and even wireless charging. What's more, they have multi-point connectivity, so I can connect the earbuds to both my phone and my laptop and seamlessly switch back and forth without having to unpair. The good people at Raycon scanned over 1,000 ears around the world, creating a design that fits almost every ear shape. This means they stay put while you're exercising, and if you get a bit sweaty or it starts to rain, no worries, because the Everyday Earbuds are both dust and water resistant, so you can blast your tunes without worry. One of my favourite things about the Raycon Everyday Earbuds is that there's no app to worry about. Everything can be controlled by intuitive touch controls. You can change everything from the noise cancellation mode to the sound profile in just a few taps. It's pretty great. There are loads of cool colour options to choose from, and if you want to add even more personality, you could slip on a protective case like this one. They also charge really fast, and just 10 minutes on the charger is enough for an hour and a half of playback. So go to buyraycon.com/neonairship to get 15% off your order today. That includes everything from earbuds to accessories and more. That's buyraycon.com/neonairship to get your discount today. Okay, time to look at some photos. We're starting as usual with the selfie camera. That's the cover screen selfie camera yet again. And apologies, the Vivo photos were mirrored, so I flipped them in my editing software, and now the watermark's backwards, but it should make them a little bit easier to compare. At a glance, I'm liking the look of the Vivo selfie a little bit better, and that's mainly for the colours. I think I look a little bit pale in the Huawei shot, but if we zoom in and look at the details, I'm seeing some weirdness with my facial hair on the Vivo shot, which happens quite often on the selfie camera. And I think it looks more realistic and natural on the Huawei shot. Same with my hair, it looks sharper and more natural on the Huawei shot, which is a little surprising considering it's only an 8 megapixel selfie camera and Vivo's got like 32 megapixels. I think the texture looks a bit better on my hood here as well. Just seems like a slightly sharper and more detailed image from Huawei. But I do prefer the colours of the Vivo. So this is a tricky one right off the bat. I'd give it to Huawei for the sharpness and the clarity, but I do prefer Vivo's colours. Okay, now again in the same location with the same cameras, but with portrait mode turned on. Huawei's done a very dramatic blur of the background, whereas Vivo's kept it a little more realistic. The Huawei didn't give me as much control over the blur effect, so I think I selected the circles preset for the background effect, and on the Vivo you can select your virtual aperture, which is set to f4 according to the watermark. However, I should flip this one around again. There we go, now we match. Seeing the exact same thing with the colours. I don't really like the way I look in the Huawei shot. My skin looks too pale. I look more alive in the Vivo shot. But it looks like both have done a very good job with the cutout. Yeah, I'm not seeing any missed areas or anything. Oh, slight error here on the Huawei shot, but only a minor one. Yeah, both have done a very good job with the cutout. I'd say the details actually look a little bit better on the portrait mode version for Vivo, but Huawei's still a step ahead with the details. My facial hair looks more natural, as does the texture of my skin. It looks a little less smoothed out. Overall, I think I'd give this one to Vivo. Yeah, the details are a tiny bit better on the Huawei shot, but the difference is pretty minimal. In this case, the cutout's better, the effect is more realistic, and the skin tones are a little bit better on the Vivo shot. However, one of the best things about using a foldable phone is that you can use the rear cameras just as easily as the selfie camera, and you should get much better results. Frustratingly, Huawei removes its watermark when you use the fold-out screen to take a selfie, but it will be on for all the rear camera photos other than the ones of my face. Pretty massive difference here. It looks like Vivo has really lifted the shadows on my face, and there's quite a lot of red tones around my face. I think I'm still a little too pale in the Huawei shot, but the colours overall I think look a bit more realistic. Contrast is definitely higher. If we zoom in a bit, there's bags more detail in the Huawei shot. Vivo has smoothed my face so much that it almost looked like I've had a fresh shave, whereas all my stubble is still visible on the Huawei image. Let's go in a little bit closer. Both are very, very good shots. Both have loads of detail. I feel like my shoulders are a little bit sharper, and the texture of my clothes might be a little bit better on the Vivo. Not everywhere. I think this one's mainly down to personal preference. Both have got a nice soft background. I think the Huawei took a better photo, but I think the Vivo photo is quite pleasing, if a little unnatural. So yeah, this one's all up to you. Which do you prefer? Now we got the same situation yet again, but with portrait mode turned on. And again, Huawei has gone for a more dramatic background blur. It might look a little less realistic, but at the very least, I do think it looks good. And again, it looks like both have done a very good job with the cutout. The difference in colours is not as extreme this time, but there's still a slightly higher level of contrast on the Huawei shot. So let's zoom in. Vivo's done a much better job this time. I'm seeing more detail in the texture of my skin, but I still think Huawei has a slight edge, and I think that's quite apparent in the hair as well. It just looks a little sharper and crisper. Although I can see this flick of hair has been lopped off by Huawei, whereas Vivo managed to keep it. However, there's a slight missed area under my earlobe on the Vivo shot. Otherwise, pretty immaculate cutouts. Can't ask for much more than that. Honestly, these are really close. Again, I'll leave it up to you. This is down to personal preference 100%, and I can't really decide. I like both of them. Now this is another portrait mode shot, although it's called aperture mode on the Huawei, but you know, basically the same thing. I tried to take these a similar focal length so that they're easier to compare. So it's the native 4x telephoto on the Huawei, and Vivo's slightly cropped into its 70mm-ish equivalent telephoto. But it's not enough of a crop that I think you'll see much of a loss in quality, so these should be quite comparable. Big difference in the colour. The Vivo image is very flat overall. It was in Zeiss Natural, by the way, whereas, yeah, the Huawei was in its original picture profile. The Huawei looks more true to what I saw with my eyes. Vivo's just, it's a little too bright and a little too cold in the colour temperature. The Huawei is miles sharper, absolutely miles sharper, and the cutout's miles better. It's not 100% perfect, like this vegetation around the foot of the statue looks a little bit weird, but it's been blurred on the Vivo when it shouldn't be. Both of the cutouts are alright, but yeah, something weird's gone on with the feet for the Vivo. It is a challenging scene with trees in the background, that's why I took this photo, to be honest. But yeah, I think it's safe to say Huawei's done a better job here. Now, this is quite an interesting one. I wanted to compare high-res shots of Batman's house because I thought like a 50 megapixel image of this scene is the perfect use case for these high-res shooting modes. But I found there's two on the Huawei camera. There's one that you can access in Pro mode. You can switch to 50 megapixel JPEG in Pro mode. But there's also a separate high-res mode, which also takes 50 megapixel shots. The one on the left is taken in high-res mode, and the one on the right is taken in Pro mode. And there's a huge difference, both when you're actually shooting and in the results. So when you actually shoot the picture, it's almost like it's taking a long exposure. You have to wait for ages for it to take the photo. Not really sure why, because it doesn't actually take a long exposure. You can see it's 1/240 something of a second. But yeah, look when we zoom in. So much sharper in the high res mode, like no contest. The one taken in pro mode looks pretty terrible, whereas the high res photo actually looks high res. And also the colors are very different. It's too green tinted in the pro mode shot. So anyway, we'll ignore the pro mode shot. If you want to take 50 megapixel shots on the Huawei, you probably want to stick to that high res mode. Now this Vivo shot was also taken in high res mode, but when I pressed the shutter, it just was like I was taking a normal photo. I wasn't waiting around. There wasn't any loading screen. I do wonder if it's maybe to do with the processor inside. But anyway, the Vivo one looks quite good, so I think they're safe to compare. Very big difference in colors. Huawei is more true to what I saw with my eye. This lower portion of the building is too dark and too orangey. It wasn't that dark in real life. The Vivo shot's definitely not as clear as the Huawei shot. It looks like there's some sharpening applied to it. It's a little noisy, but with more defined lines, whereas the edges are slightly blurrier on the Huawei shot, but they look less processed, if you know what I mean. Looks like the dynamic range is better on the Huawei shot. You can see into this room a bit better. It's very dark on the Vivo. Yeah, no contest. I much prefer this Huawei shot, but I think it's worth showing the Pro Mode 50 megapixel shot next to the Vivo, because in that case, the Vivo's way better. So make sure you use the right mode, because you might end up with this disappointing image rather than the actual nice 50 megapixel image. Both pretty good overall, but I think Huawei's nailed that one. Now these two are just standard 12 megapixel photos that you take by default in the camera app. They're both on the ultra wide, and at a glance, Huawei's smashing it with the colours again. I think those colours look spot on. Everything is a bit pale on the Vivo shot. Both have got very good dynamic range, but I think I like the way Huawei has rendered the clouds a bit better. A little bit more contrast in there. Makes the photo kind of pop a bit more. When we zoom in, I would say there's a similar level of detail on each, but I think the Vivo's just a touch too contrasty and over sharpened slightly. So yeah, I'd give this one to Huawei. I do think it's close, but I do think the Huawei's better. Now just a quick run through of the zoom range on the other side of this building. Seeing the exact same thing with the ultra wide shots. The colours are spot on the Huawei. Everything's too pale on the Vivo. And I wouldn't say either has a massive advantage in terms of detail, but the processing is slightly different. I think Vivo has slightly more sharpening applied, and it's kind of working. These are really, really close. The only thing that really stands out is the color, which I think Huawei has done better. Now the main camera, and again the same thing with the color. The level of the greens might be slightly too high on the Huawei shot, but other than that, it's looking pretty spot on. Vivo has for some reason just lifted the shadows too much. The image looks slightly washed out as a result. Huawei might be slightly too dark, but it's very slight. Both have a very good level of detail. Vivo does look slightly sharper. So yeah, tricky one. In terms of colours, it's Huawei. In terms of sharpness, I'd give it to Vivo. Now at 2x zoom, and I will say that the main camera of the Huawei is 1mm more zoomed in, but that does have a cumulative effect. So as we go up the zoom range, the Huawei's always going to be slightly more zoomed in than the Vivo, which is a bit of a pain for comparison, but what can you do? Colours, basically the same thing I said about the other ones. The consistency at least seems to be quite good. Both lose a tiny bit of sharpness by using the 2x, but I think Huawei retains it better. Like if you look at this moulding on the drain pipe up here, that's really clear. It's blurry on the Vivo shot. But other areas, like this corner here, looks a bit blurry on the Huawei shot and looks much cleaner on the Vivo shot. It's real close. Again, hard to point out a winner, but I'm just showing you the results I got. Now these are our native telephoto focal lengths, so the Huawei's at 4x and the Vivo's at 3x. Colours match, which is always good. Detail looks great on both of them. But I would say I think the Vivo's slightly sharper than the Huawei, despite being not as zoomed in. Now continuing to zoom in on this guy, this is at 10x. Colours remain unchanged. Now things are starting to look a little bit over-processed, but still decent. I feel like the eyes look better on the Vivo shot, but some of the texture in the background looks a bit watercolour-like. Everything's a bit more grainy on the Huawei shot, but I would say it maybe looks slightly less processed. And if we go to maximum zoom, well, then it pretty much looks like you're taking a photo of a TV screen. It's you lose all of the three-dimensionality of it. It's all kind of washed out and over-processed. Processed in a slightly different way. I don't know. Take your pick there. Now, just for good measure, we'll test maximum zoom again. And this is just a shot to give you context where I'm taking the photo from. I'm at the top of this hill and we're going to zoom in on these cars all the way in this car park across the field. And this is what you get. Impressive that you can zoom that far, but not really usable photos at 100 times zoom. Huawei is way contrastier, but it might only look that way because Vivo's completely washed out. Not much there in terms of detail. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend zooming to 100x on either of these phones. Okay, now we've got a few shots from inside Wayne Manor, which is actually a natural history museum and not Batman's lair. These two photos were taken in portrait mode or aperture mode on Huawei. And as usual, Huawei has done a more dramatic effect with the blur, whereas Vivo's kept it a little more realistic. These are both at 2x, by the way, so digital crop on the main sensor. But yeah, I think the effect looks good on both of them. I do like these massive bokeh balls we've got on the Huawei shot. And I do like the warmer colours we've got. Not actually sure which one's most realistic. Maybe the Vivo, to be honest. The lighting wasn't that warm. It's like, you know, museum lighting. It's not super warm. Good level of detail on both. I think slightly higher contrast on the Huawei, which is bringing out texture of the bone here. Pretty good cutout on both, considering the complexity of the subject and how busy the background was. But if you're looking for isolation, I would say Huawei's done better because it's, you know, you can barely tell what's in the background, whereas almost in focus on the Vivo shot. I think this is purely personal preference. I think the Huawei effect is slightly overdone. Vivo's is much more convincing, but if you want that really stylized look, there's no denying that Huawei has given you more style. And another one from the same location with the portrait mode effects turned on again. And we're seeing exactly the same thing. Much blurrier background from the Huawei, which really separates our subject and just obliterates the background. Whereas Vivo's toned it down. For this one, we're on the telephoto of the Huawei and we're a slight crop into Vivo's telephoto just because that's one of the presets. 85mm is one of the presets in portrait mode. Huawei definitely looks a little bit sharper. I'm sorry if we have any butterfly phobes watching. Cutout's pretty good on both. Again, these are too different to really pick a winner. The colours are definitely more realistic on the Vivo shot, but the stylized extra warmth of the Huawei shot does look very appealing to me. Okay, these two were taken through some glass that wasn't particularly clean, which is why we've got this haze over the whole image. But I actually think that looks quite cool. These are the native telephoto lengths, 4x for the Huawei, 3x for the Vivo. So they might be a little tricky to compare. Colours basically the same on both. I can see some lines in the background of the Vivo shot, which may be flicker from the LED lighting. I'm not entirely sure. I tapped on the eye on both of them for focus, and both look perfectly sharp. I really like the way the feathers look on the Vivo. I think they look better. They look a little soft, and the details are a little muddied on the Huawei shot. But I also took a shot at 4x equivalent, so these might be easier to compare. We're basically seeing the same thing. The lines in the background have disappeared. Still not sure if it's flicker or not, but what can you do? Again, the focus is spot on. Again, the colours are very similar. And again, the feathers look better on the Vivo. I'd give this one to the Vivo. This is quite funny. Part of the reason I came to this location is because the Huawei has an incredible macro camera, and there's this exhibit of tiny works of art, and I was like, oh, that'll be perfect. But they were so tiny that you could only see them with an actual microscope. So I don't have any photos of these works of art, but so instead I took a picture of a microscope. This is with portrait mode on, and it's at 2x. I think we're basically going to see the same thing as we saw with the other portrait mode shots. You can already see that the background's much blurrier on the Huawei. Vivo effect is less dramatic, but maybe more realistic. The roll-off is a little more realistic. Both have got a good level of sharpness, but I would say Vivo looks a tiny bit sharper up here, and Huawei looks a tiny bit sharper down here. That might just be down to the focal point. A little bit of AI crust on the text on the Huawei shot, whereas it's kept a little cleaner on the Vivo. In this case, I prefer the Vivo shot for the lack of AI artifacts and the more realistic effect. So to actually show you the macro capabilities of these phones, I had to shoot at home. I was using this tiny flower. The photo on the left is just to illustrate how small this flower is. It's like less than the size of the tip of my finger. And on the right is how close you can get with the Vivo telephoto, which is pretty damn close and already very impressive. However, the Huawei can get this close, which is kind of crazy. And it actually has another trick up its sleeve. So when you take a macro photo, because you're so close to the subject, your depth of field is just going to be really shallow. So as you can see in this one, this part of the flower is in focus, but even these petals, they're all completely blurry. Petals down here are completely blurry. You've only got a very thin sliver that stays in focus. The Mate X6 has something called extended depth of field mode, which basically works like focus stacking, which is a technique professional photographers use. And if you activate it, you get this on the right. Essentially, what the phone does is it quickly shifts focus and takes multiple images, and then it stitches them all together seamlessly. So rather than just having this area of the photo in focus, we've got all these leaves in focus down here. Everything stays in focus, and it's all super sharp. So yeah, it's pretty handy if you love macro photos, and it's one of, if not the only phone that can do that. That's really cool. But going back to our comparison, both are really cool photos, both are really impressive, but obviously Huawei's way closer. And yes, on the Vivo you can use a digital crop, like this one's at 6x, which gets you a lot closer to the flower, but you're not actually closer, you're just cropping in. And you can do the same thing on the Huawei. So at 6x, Huawei looks like that on the left, and Vivo looks like that on the right. And this isn't with the focus stacking turned on, but I could turn it on and get a lot more in focus. So yeah, both are very impressive for macro photography, but Huawei's way ahead. Okay, moving on to nighttime photos now, and we're starting with a selfie on the cover screen selfie cameras. It looks like Huawei has completely messed up my skin tones here. I look really red for some reason, whereas I think Vivo's done a better job with my face. Otherwise, exposure's looking quite similar, but when we zoom in, the Huawei is much sharper. Texture of my skin's much sharper. Yeah, it looks like my facial hair is like motion blurry on the Vivo. And the same thing with the texture of my beanie up here and the sharpness of my hair. It's miles better on the Huawei. So yeah, tricky one, because I much prefer the Vivo shot at a glance. I think the colours are better. I think it's more flattering. But as a photo, the details are way better on the Huawei. So yeah, kind of a hard one to call that. Now same shot with portrait mode turned on. As always, we don't have much control over the blur level on the Huawei, and it's a pretty extreme blur, whereas Vivo's is more realistic and subtle. Colours are better on the Vivo yet again. Way too red in my face. Maybe not quite as bad as last time, but still not ideal. This time the Huawei's not as good with the texture of my face. It looks like some smoothing might have been applied, and Vivo looks about the same, but by comparison, it's looking better. I'd give this one to Vivo. Now these two photos are taken on the main rear camera. There's no portrait mode. This is genuine bokeh that you get from the lenses. Both looking pretty good at a glance. I think the colour of my hoodie is more accurate on the Huawei. Skin tones look pretty good on both. There is a slight difference, but both look pretty acceptable. And both have a nice level of blur to the background. I think this one's too close to call for me. Both of these look fantastic. Some of the textures look a bit better on the Huawei, but we're splitting hairs. Both of these are fantastic. Now same situation on the rear cameras, but with portrait mode turned on. And I ramped up the blur level on the Vivo to try and match Huawei, and it has. Both of these look very good. Both cutouts look good. I think Huawei's skin tones look more accurate. Both have managed to keep strands of hair in the foreground, although it's not the cleanest job by Huawei there. I think Vivo's might be a tiny bit cleaner. Although I'm impressed that there's like little bobbles on my hat that have been cut out by Huawei, where there's like maybe a slight error there. Either way, pretty flawless on both. But yeah, I just think the skin tones are a bit better on Huawei's shot, and it might be the tiniest bit sharper, but it's really close. Okay, now we're going to run through all the different lenses at one of my favourite spots. These are both on the ultra wide, and both are looking pretty good at a glance. There are some differences in the colour. These were taken at exactly the same time, so we've not got different things showing on the video screens or anything like that. The reds are richer and darker in the Huawei shot. They've come across more orangey on the Vivo. Can't remember what colour they actually were, so kind of hard to say who's done a better job there. The Slim Chicken sign is looking a bit funky on the Huawei shot, but it's looking a little soft on the Vivo. I think these people look a bit better on the Huawei shot, and the contrast level is a little lower, which means you can see more of the shadowy areas. Big difference in the neon signs up here. They've come across more white or orangey on the Vivo shot, where they're more pinky red on Huawei, but I think they're easier to read on the Vivo shot. These are really, really close, too close to call in my opinion. I think that's all down to personal preference. Now these are on the main camera, and again, there's a bit of a difference in colour. Vivo's a little bit warmer, the lights are looking a bit warmer. Both are looking pretty sharp at a glance. Ooh, some weird stuff going on with the Huawei shot on these video screens. Like, this should be a straight line, but it's gone all wiggly. And yeah, there's bits that are blurred. I guess that's like a compression artifact maybe. Quite weird, that. Vivo looks slightly sharper, and it's a little more contrasty. Both have got good dynamic range. Both have retained the text on the backlit sign. Both have made the neon signs legible, and you can tell that they're red on both of them. I think I'll give this to Vivo simply because I don't like those weird artifacts that we got on the Huawei shot. Now these are at 2x, so digital crop of the main sensor. Vivo's gone very orangey, a little too orangey I think. It's sharper, but Huawei's got some halation around the light sources, which I don't mind. I think that looks quite nice. The text has gone a bit gross on the backlit sign. It's very hard to read on the Vivo, whereas it's nice and crisp on the Huawei shot. Yeah, I think the Huawei shot looks more natural. The softness is more natural on these plants, whereas the Vivo looks quite over sharpened. I think both are good, but the lighting's off on the Vivo and it looks too sharp, so I'll give this one to Huawei. Now these are our native telephoto lengths on each phone. That's 70mm equivalent on the Vivo, 96mm equivalent on the Huawei. It's always hard to compare photos taken at different focal lengths, but Huawei's looking more true to life. I think the saturation's too high in this red in the Vivo shot, and the contrast is too high in general. But neither are bad. I just prefer the lower contrast and the lower level of sharpness that we're getting on the Huawei shot. And if we zoom them in to match, I'm sure we're going to see the same thing. So we're doing a bigger digital crop on the Vivo to match the telephoto of the Huawei. And yeah, it's the same thing. I think these plants illustrate my point the best. They just look a lot more natural on the Huawei shot. They look a bit overcooked on the Vivo. And this text is much more natural looking, and you can tell that it's red text, whereas the sharpening and contrast has kind of made it look almost black on the Vivo. Both very good, but Huawei's done a better job there. Now this is a really interesting spot because it has some of the warmest lighting I've ever seen on the church, contrasted with a very white, pale LED in this street light here. So you get one building that's like all white and one that's super yellowy, and it always looks cool in photos. In this case, I think Huawei has got the colors more accurate. It looks exaggerated, but that is how it looks in real life. Whereas I feel like Vivo might have toned it down very slightly, but you still get the same effect. Vivo is a lot sharper at the top of the church here. It's looking pretty blurry on the Huawei. And I can see the texture of this wooden beam a lot better on the Vivo. So for the details, I'll give it to Vivo. I do think the colors are maybe slightly better on the Huawei, but Vivo's taken the better photo here. Now another photo on the same street, and this is a pretty low light area. Not as dark as the really dark street, but getting close to that. Slight difference in color in these two. I think Vivo's probably slightly more accurate, but I like the slight green tint that we got on the Huawei. I think it's very stylish. Vivo looks sharper to me on the brickwork here and on the cobbled street. It's very close, but I think the extra sharpness of the Vivo is doing it some favors here, and I think it's the better shot. Now these two were taken on the telephotos, so obviously they're at a slightly different level of zoom, and without zooming in, I can tell that the Vivo is going to be sharper. Yeah, I think there's just the tiniest bit of motion blur on the Huawei shot, whereas the Vivo is much crisper. It's very easy to see on the details of this lamppost here. No contest, Vivo takes that one. So we'll finish off our comparison with photos from the really dark street. We're starting on the ultra wide, and all of these were taken in the phone's dedicated night mode. You can see the Huawei took a much longer exposure, 5 seconds versus 0.3 seconds, and there's a massive difference in colour. Loads of magenta in the Huawei shot. Vivo's done its thing where it pretends the sky's blue, but Vivo's very blurry. I really like the blue sky effect when it works well, and it can work well, but here especially shows you what I don't like about it. You can see the actual colour of the sky through all these trees in the foreground, and then the blue's just been pasted on over the top. It's a bit weird. Yeah, sometimes I really like it, but I don't like it in this case, and it doesn't matter anyway because the photo's blurry. I don't know why Huawei's so magenta, but it's sharper than the Vivo, so it takes the win here. Now onto the main lens, where things are looking a lot better. And again, Huawei did a really long exposure, 3 whole seconds versus 1/5 of a second. It is a bit more magenta-y in the sky, but the colours are looking a lot more accurate in this one. Vivo's gone for the cool tones, which is also kind of accurate, but it's done the fake blue sky thing again, which isn't realistic. And we're seeing the same thing with the trees. You can see the actual colour of the sky poking through. I don't like that. Both look quite noisy in the shadow areas. We might need to zoom a bit more for this one. Yeah, both are pretty noisy. Neither are sharp enough to see the car number plates. It's pretty close, but because that blue sky effect hasn't really worked in Vivo's favour, I'll give this one to Huawei. Finally, our telephotos, and we can see that they actually did use the telephoto lenses this time, because we've got f3 on the Mate X6 and f2.57 on the X Fold 3 Pro. And yet again, really long exposure on the Huawei, pretty quick on the Vivo. But what kind of results does that get us? Neither of these are great, both lack in detail. Some weird AI squigglies in the road on the Huawei shot, much sharper on the Vivo shot. Don't know if any of that's real, but it looks better. These plants are sharper too. I'd give this one to Vivo, but really neither of these are very good. Alright, I think that's about it for this one. I think these phones are quite closely matched, but overall I would give it to Huawei. I think if someone asked me which foldable phone has the absolute best cameras, it's got to be the Mate X6. The Vivo's extremely close, and if I had to buy one, I would buy the Vivo still. The simple reason is Huawei's software is still a pain to live with in 2025. Trust me, I've done it. You can get all your Google apps working, but it's not an ideal situation. You'll still get things like delayed notifications, stuff like Google Wallet won't work properly. It's not ideal. So, I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. And if you like this kind of thing, get subscribed, because there's always more phones on the way. And I will catch you in the next one. Toodles.